Welcome back, everyone. You guys know the OnePlus 8 and 8 Pro came out, so, your boy had to go and review the 2017 model of the OnePlus lineup. OnePlus decided not to send me out a phone, which is kind of salty. I talk about OnePlus a lot. I think I've owned all of them for the most part, and they still don't want to support the boy. But OnePlus, if you're watching this, please send me out an 8 Pro or 8. The viewers want to see this. They want to see all the comparisons and all the nitty gritty, all that stuff. But I'll buy it and I'll do the comparisons myself. But we're going to be looking at the OnePlus 5 and seeing how it holds up in 2020. Now, this phone came out in 2017, which if you guys don't know, that was about 3 years ago. And I can tell you this phone really isn't even that bad of a phone. It's not that old of a phone either. For sure, at the end of the day, it's aged a little bit. You still have that type of older little bit of design. I think the next model after this actually changed up the design, which was the OnePlus 5T. And I can tell you, this isn't that bad looking of a phone. I remember when this thing came out, a lot of people were immediately starting to pinpoint it a little bit and say, oh, it looks just like the iPhone 7 Plus, this and that. But this was the way of the future. And now all the phones kind of look like this, and they kind of obviously look better than this with lower bezels and more cameras. And it's kind of cool that we have the OnePlus 8 and 8 Pro that came out. So once that one I get my hands on it, I can go and compare it to this one if I want to. So looking on the front of this phone, we have a 5.5-inch optic AMOLED display. It is a 1080p display, and as I've said before in my other review that I've done on this phone not too long ago, or I think it was a year ago or something like that, this phone's display is really not that bad for a 1080p display. I think it's something to do with the mixture of OLED and just the color profile that OnePlus uses on their displays. I don't know who manufactures these displays, but their 1080p displays were really not that bad. I think the OnePlus 6 also had a 1080p display, and all those phones had pretty decent displays for the most part. They looked really good. I don't know about all that color accuracy and all that, but they looked pretty good for an OLED display, so that was really awesome. I really like that. Now on the bottom of that display, you have a fingerprint sensor home button / thing, which is really, really cool. You have the capacitive buttons next to it, so you can always go and, change those around if you want to. Up top, that earpiece. And you have the volume button, power button, all that stuff. And now you do have USB Type-C on this phone, which is really, really awesome. You have the headphone jack, which is really cool as well. And on the back, you had that dual camera setup like I said before. Now, unfortunately, there was no wireless charging on this device, which honestly is probably expected because no OnePlus phone had wireless charging until the recent one, the OnePlus 8 and 8 Pro. So it's crazy they went all this time without having a wireless charging capacity or capability on those phones, which is really crazy. In terms of the way it feels in the hand, it still feels like a pretty good device. It doesn't feel like a cheap device at all, but it is kind of on the lower end because the phone, it isn't built out of glass completely. The front is built out of glass, but the back, it isn't really made. It's made out of this polycarbonate, whatever plastic thing, like the older iPhones. I think maybe it was aluminum, I don't know. It doesn't feel cheap. You're probably going to put a case on your phone anyway, but it is kind of one thing to kind of consider. It doesn't feel like the most premium flagship with glass on the back and all that stuff. There's no IP certification on this phone either, so if you get some water on it, probably expect it to not handle it as well as if you were to put water on a OnePlus 8 or 8 Pro. Those phones do have IP certification, so that kind of really covers it up in terms of the outside. There's really not more to hit on in that department. But hating on the software, this is probably one of my favorite things about OnePlus, and this is why OnePlus needs to go and send me a phone. I hype up the software so much. It is really one of my favorite softwares out in the game right now. Oxygen OS has always been, probably since even the beginning, probably since I bought my first OnePlus phone, I think the OnePlus 2 or something like that. Whichever phone came with Oxygen OS, I immediately saw such a huge light at the end of the tunnel, because at first I was like, there's really only one main manufacturer that makes stock Android, and that's Google. But then OnePlus came out and their software was pretty much stock Android and minimalistic at its core, but with more features built in. It was like a custom ROM of stock without rooting and all that, and I love it. Nowadays they're kind of getting into a space where stock Android is catching up. But still, OnePlus and with Oxygen OS is really awesome, and I can't knock them for that. Their software support is pretty good too. So the phone started off with Android 7.1.1 Nougat. Apparently it was able to get Android 10, but as far as I know, these phones are able to, be rooted and custom ROM. So if you want to, you can always go and try to find a custom ROM for these phones, which is probably not going to be too hard. I'm sure there's still a pretty big development community behind these phones, considering this phone was pretty popular back in the day. So this phone in terms of software is not going anywhere. It's definitely going to last you for a bit of time. Yeah, it's probably not going to last you. It's already kind of outdated. It didn't get Android 10, but still at the end of the day, Android Pie is pretty relevant to today, and it's still getting security updates as far as I know too. So in terms of everything on the software, I give it a thumbs up in my books. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this thing has the Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 chipset, an octa-core CPU, and Adreno 540 GPU, and there were two different models of this phone. The base model, which was the 64GB model with 6GB of RAM, and that top tier model, the 128GB model with 8GB of RAM. Now what I can tell you about the performances is that luckily this phone was able to kind of be future-proofed with that RAM, so if you had that top tier model with the 8GB, that's kind of irrelevant to today. That's pretty much what every single phone has nowadays. Like, it doesn't have like 3 or 4 gigs of RAM anymore. They have like 8 to 12, and 12 is like that top tier. If you have 12 gigs of RAM on your phone, you're pretty much set. Where the OnePlus 6 has 8 on that top tier model. Now I had the 6 gig of RAM option, which is still pretty good. A lot of basic phones nowadays have it, and I think for sure at the end of the day this phone kind of handles 6 gigs RAM pretty well too. The thing is though, is to kind of keep in mind is that as phones, as time goes on, apps get bigger and bigger, and they demand more from phones and demand more resources. So with 6 gigs, you're kind of still okay for the most part for the next year or two. But I kind of see in the next couple years, maybe phones will start, apps will start demanding more and more RAM in order to keep things functioning. So I don't know, maybe it's not good enough. I think it's good for the most part. And I can tell you with the performance on this phone, it's still pretty good for a 2017 phone. Phones that came out in 2017 are like the Samsung Galaxy S8 and the iPhone 10. Those are like the two major ones. And I think for the most part, this phone is still pretty much up there with this one. Luckily, I think the OnePlus 5 is actually faster than the Galaxy S8. And again, I think it has a lot to do with the software. Even though this phone doesn't really look like the newest phone anymore, it's still kind of up there with the performance. Even if you go and just do some basic things with it, or even if you go top tier and start doing high-end gaming and stuff like that, you will definitely see some stuttering frames and stuff. But I think it's good for the most part. With that Snapdragon 835, I don't think it was horrible. I think a lot of people kind of hated on certain aspects of just Snapdragon processors overall. But I think for sure at the end of the day, this phone in terms of performance will definitely be okay for this day and age. However, if you want to get better performance, I would recommend picking up a OnePlus 6 or 6T or OnePlus 7 Pro, which I will leave linked down in the description below so you can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But I think for sure at the end of the day, the performance of this phone is something you're probably not going to be complaining about, especially if you consider the fact that this phone is over 3 years old at this point. So that pretty much covers it up there. Now hitting on the cameras, this thing has a dual camera setup on the back, like I stated, a 16 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 20 megapixel standard lens. I don't really know what that means. You're able to shoot 4K at 30 frames, and the OnePlus camera is pretty basic at its core as well. It doesn't really have crazy things going on with it, but I think for overall the camera is actually pretty decent. It could have been better if they had, put in 4K at 60, but this was back in 2017 and not a lot of phones were even shooting 4K at that time, so it's totally okay. And I think for the camera, for the most part, it's a camera. OnePlus has never been the greatest at their cameras for sure, and this is no exception. This wasn't really an amazing camera even at the time, but it's okay. If you're going to take photos and things in good lighting, then I think you're going to be good for the most part. But if you're going to go indoors and you're going to take photos from random things, it's probably not going to be the best if I'm being honest, but it is what it is. A phone like a Galaxy S8 or an iPhone 10 will give you better photos than this phone for sure. On the front, you have a 16 megapixel wide angle lens. You can shoot 1080p videos on it, and other than that, there's really nothing else to hit on. I mean, it's a good camera for sure for the age, but it's not the best even of the year that it came out. So it is what it is, but that's pretty much the camera. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 3,300 milliamp hour battery, which really isn't that bad of a size battery. It only has a 1080p display. It's not a super high resolution panel. It's not a super powerful phone that can delete everything on. It's not anything like that, you know what I mean? It's a good phone, and I think for the battery, it's average for the most part. With the Galaxy S8, that thing had a 3,000 milliamp hour battery, which is still pretty good, but this one had a bigger size battery and a lower resolution panel, so this one I think gives you better battery life than that phone. But the thing also to keep in mind is that over time batteries do degrade, so this thing does not have a full 3,300 milliamp hour battery anymore. It's probably at 3,000 or even lower than that. It's probably lower than that, but it's totally okay still. I wouldn't really complain about that aspect too much. But the battery life on this phone, if it's brand new stock, it's going to be pretty good, but if it's used, you might want to see and check how bad the battery has degraded and then kind of determine from there. So in terms of everything, that pretty much covers it. So is the OnePlus 5 still worth it in 2020? I will tell you, I think this phone is probably still worth it in 2020, especially if you root it and custom ROM it. That would be really, really awesome. You can get some really cool custom ROMs out of this thing for sure, I would imagine. But the thing to also keep in mind is that these things, as far as I know, are pretty hard to get, and they're still pretty pricey, mostly because, a lot of people own them when they came out and they're still using them, or they just sold them off and there's really not that big of a supply for these phones, so these things on auction on eBay go like for sale all the time, but they're still pretty expensive. So what I would recommend you to do is look into the OnePlus 6s, the 6Ts, or the OnePlus 7 Pros. If you want to go on that route, I would highly recommend you to do it, which like I stated, I'll find the cheapest ones on Amazon. I'll link them down below. But that's pretty much it, man. The OnePlus 5 I think is still worth it in 2020. So that's pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.